order for me to, to tell those stories honestly, I have to begin to tell my stories by including my racial identity. And this for me is what writing The Other Talk is all about. I'm using stories from my own life to talk about racism in America, but to talk about it in terms of this is what privilege looks like. So it is incredibly important for you to read Jason Reynolds' books that are many, many novels that are about real incidents from his own life. And you can learn stories from people who have experienced the kind of pain and brutalization and dehumanization that Jason talks about in his work. But folks like me, white folks like me, need to also tell our stories truthfully. And I think that means not just talking about the pain that happens to others, but to talk about the unfair advantages that we are gifted and granted over and over and over and over again. I think it's essential for us to clarify what racism looks like in our own life by talking about those examples, by talking about those advantages. And this is something that came out of conversations that Jason and I were having, because in 2014, when Jason and I were traveling, in August of 2014, Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And Jason and I were talking about this, and we were saying, we've been talking. Why don't we try to do something? And if we're both writers, what would it be like if we wrote a book together? A black man and a white man side by side, co-writing a novel about two teens, one black, one white, and a moment of police brutality. Not one in which a young black boy is killed, because as Jason said, we've seen and heard these stories enough. What we need are stories that highlight young folks of color, young black folks in particular, who survive and thrive in the face of the constant dehumanization by law enforcement, and what it means for the white kids out there in the world who are witness to this. And even if you're not witness to it with your own two eyes on the street in front of you, all of us who are white we have been bearing witness in some form or another in national media since Emmett Till's murder. This is a multi-generational task of witness that we may not have lived up to at all in our lives, and need to do so more. And so what would it be like to write a novel in which we are co-writing from a race-conscious perspective, the experience of what so many young folks are going through in our country today. In order for us to write this novel together, we would keep going back and forth about, what it was like for each of us growing up and the differences, those two Americas, right? In order for us to talk about that, Jason had to talk about the talk his mother gave him day in, day out, starting from when he was 10 years old. And it's not my talk and not the one for me to give. So I'm not going to try to repeat it like the way that Jason would. But in a sense, it is a talk about how to survive and navigate racism in America, in particular with regards to law enforcement. But not only that, as Jason has said in many of our presentations together, what it was like basically was his mother talking about what it meant for him to walk out his front door as a young black man in America. And while my parents were certainly people who raised me to think that racism is wrong, not once in my life growing up that I can remember did my parents give me a talk to talk about what it meant to be a young white boy growing up in America. And this is at the exact same time when I'm a middle school white boy, right? One of the reasons why I'm unprepared to talk about racism, even though I say I want to talk about how racism is bad, because I'm not attuned to thinking about how my own racial identity is a part of the story of racism in America. Race is a construct, right? There's actually no such thing as Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates have mentioned many times. People who believe themselves to be white, right? There's no such thing as a white person, and yet there is certainly such thing as a racial construct that creates the social fact, if not the biological fact of race in America, and that deeply affects us. So my not being able to talk about my own racial identity, I think, impedes upon my ability to participate genuinely and authentically in conversations about racism in America, because I'm not even talking about my own life. I'm talking about other people. And that, I think, is part of the problem. So Jason and I were talking about the talk versus Mr. Brendan Keily no talk, right? So what would it mean as we were then writing this book together and then traveling the country and talking about this book together? What would it mean for white families to begin to grapple with their own white privilege, to talk about racial identity as it is an active player in interactions of personal racism, but also as it contributes to the larger systemic and structural racism in America. I was saying earlier that, you know, I was thinking about all this as what I wasn't prepared for as a young person. Let me give you an example. When I was in middle school, I liked acting, and I imagined myself, maybe as many young folks do, stepping into my 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol has told us we all get now. And so I wanted to be an actor and a child model. And I was very fortunate that there was this agency, the Cameo Agency in Boston, Massachusetts, that got behind me and wanted me to get involved. And I was able to do a little bit of modeling for a couple of magazines, and I did a couple of national commercials, and it was very exciting, right? But I will never forget, in hindsight, one of the casting directors say, "Oh, Brendan, yes, we really want you for this role. We want you for this part because you, Brendan, you look like the all-American boy." And my young ears heard that as a tremendous compliment, as opposed to, as Jason Reynolds said when we were coming up with the title for All American Boys, he said, "The term All-American lands in my ears like a slur because I always felt excluded." And I think for young folks and for families like mine to be more conscious of talking about our racial identity, I might have a bit more wherewithal to say something to the effect of, "Don't you mean I look like one of many all-American boys?" Right? As opposed to that definite article is therein lies the racism. I think is part of why it's so important for us, those of us who are adults, who say we believe in social change, who believe in the power of trying to affect things for a better society, need to help young folks who also want that. And I'm going to get to this in a moment, who also really want that, help provide them with the language. Because I think we need, if we want to affect change, we need the language of change. And our young folks at heart want to affect change, but it's our role as adults to help provide them with some of the language so that they can have the conversations they're already, I was going to say dying to have. And I think the double entendre is sickly true there. And it's important. Forgive me for being a little emotional right now, but as someone who has worked in classrooms in New York City for 10 years, someone who is on the road and in schools all across this country, and certainly before COVID was in schools, but now traveling virtually, I get to talk to young folks all across this country. And I get to talk to young folks in Alaska. I get to talk to young folks in Florida, in all points in between. And over and over and over again, I hear young people saying, "I want to learn more so that I can do more." And we owe it to them. We owe it to them. And so I think it's really important to stick our necks out there and try to help shape this language. Now, I started this by saying this is just one piece of a large puzzle, right? I am by no means joining this call to say that I have discovered, again, the definite article, the answer, or the language. I think it's important for white folks like me to stick our necks out there and fail. Because I have failed. I will continue to fail, but can't we fail better and fail in public so that all of us can learn better? I think that's really important. As Jason and I were traveling around the country talking about All American Boys, there were many instances where we were on stage. We've been invited to talk about our book and to talk about, and often, what would come up were how that related to other real-time political moments that were happening, like Colin Kaepernick taking a knee or whatever it might be, right? And there were many times where I might have said something in public on stage that missed the mark, that misunderstood part of what the question might have been, right? And Jason corrected me in public. And that's a good thing. Because if I'm in it just for me, then it, I'm not really in it for racial justice, right? I think part of what the other talk has to be about is not only discussing for white folks like and white families like mine, what it means to grapple with our racial identity, but also what it means to begin to grapple with how can we listen without being defensive? How can we listen actively, not hear and let it go out the other ear, right? Not only digest intellectual information, but as many people have said in many different fashions, listen so that we hold other people's stories in our heart as if they were our own. I want to give you one anecdote about this because I think this is, and I mentioned this in the book because there is a structure to the book that begins with so many of my own stories, but then leads into, well, okay, yes, it's important for us to talk, white folks, but not too much, obviously. And it's important for us to be honest about our racial identity, but also it's important for us to get involved in action. And I think that sometimes, especially white folks like me, think, well, let's just get involved and let's go solve some problem, or let's go do something right away. We've skipped over all the important steps before. There are 5 chapters in this book dedicated to listening. And I think white folks like me need to do a much better job listening to the truth coming from communities and families of color across this country. Listening is an action, as the writer Renee Watson and I have written about in articles that we have co-written together. Listening is an action, and it's an action that we can do much more deeply. And the anecdote that I want to share with you that brings this home is I was speaking to a school in Maine, and I mentioned this in the book, and it was a predominantly white school in Maine. And there was, at the end of my presentation that I was doing for the school, a young Black girl spoke up. And she was speaking to me, but she was speaking to me in the guise of speaking to her classmates. And she essentially said, it was a question about empathy, but in the subtext of what she was asking was, why won't you believe me? Why won't, when I tell my stories about racism in our community, why won't you believe me? And I think part of what the other talk would be about for families having these conversations and providing language for young folks is what it means to create more space so that those stories, like what this young girl had to share, are A, given airtime, but B, then given the respect to be believed. And I think that if we're forming a language for young folks, and in particular, in this instance, young white folks, to embrace that as part of their action for more racial justice, then what we're doing is not having white folks come in with their, super person capes and try to save the day, which is of no good to anybody because nobody's asking for that. But instead to be, again, more genuine partners in the communities that have already been doing this work for decades and decades and decades and decades. This is, I'm not sharing anything new. I think all I'm trying to do is share a way to be, to empower young folks, and in particular, young white folks, with being more genuine and authentic members in the action communities that are already hard at work. I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A, so I'm going to actually begin to curtail this talk. I have many anecdotes to share, and I can go on at length to answer questions. But again, like I said, I want to highlight the airtime and space to a young person who stepped up here. And so I just want to end with a couple of points. One of the reasons why Jason and I were talking about this book, and then I was trying to think about how to write the other talk, was because even as someone who was a teacher who was trying to actively change my curriculum and highlight more diverse voices in the curriculum than the predominantly white curriculum I had been given, trying to actively empower young students from the global majority in my school as a teacher in New York City, there were many blind spots I had. And one of them was highlighted to me by some colleagues who were colleagues of color, other teachers. And I was at a party with them one night, not all that long after Barack Obama had been elected president and then began his presidency. And even as someone who was so well-intentioned as I was, I got into a conversation that night in a Black family's home, talking about Barack Obama as my president. And I'm saying this, I'm sharing this all with you through the hindsight of recognizing where I had failed in this moment. And I want to make sure I'm clear about this. Talking about him in a way that was like, well, you know, George Bush is not my president. He's not my guy, right? Blah, 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 blah. And the more I was beginning to dig this hole that I didn't realize I was digging was because I wasn't reading the room. And I wasn't listening to the Black family whose home I was in about why having a portrait of Barack Obama on their wall was so darn important, right? And I was trying to turn into an intellectual argument about why I was intellectually more aligned with Barack Obama, not hearing the history, the meaning for that family, and what it meant to speak about community in a way that I'm not a part of. And I don't have to insert myself and claim to be a part of it, especially if I claim to be an ally. Then I can stand outside the door sometimes. That's okay. And I was grateful that folks had were patient enough that evening and in the days after to begin to ask me to do a bit more work. And most of that work that they were asking me to do was to begin to investigate, as the terminology, as we would call it that time and thereafter, investigate my whiteness and begin to form a language to talk about my own racial identity in a way that was meaningful and helpful to racial justice, not escaping that conversation or not choosing to ignore it and then becoming a part of the problem in the moment like I was that night. I share those failures and many others in the book. And if you want to read about somebody who fails and fails again, please read the book. But I also think it's important to recognize that failure is part of a larger systemic issue. And so this is my last anecdote, and then we're kicking it over to the Q&A. So I'm talking about personal moments from my life here and over and over again, right? But it's connected to the bigger issue. And here's what I want to say. So one of those moments where Jason and I were traveling the country together, we walked into a bank in Washington, D.C. Jason was the client at this bank. He went up to the teller to do a transaction. The bank manager said, the teller said, I need to get the bank manager for this. In order for me to do this, let me get the bank manager. The bank manager comes out. The bank manager is a white guy like me. He comes into the lobby. Jason and I are standing in the lobby. He walks right past Jason, sticks his hand out to me, and he says, "How can I help you, sir?" Dismissing the humanity of Jason Reynolds right there in the room, dismissing his dignity, or as Ralph Ellison has written about, so eloquently, the rendering Jason invisible in that moment, right? That kind of a moment, right, is not unlike when I am reviewing my own family's history and I'm reviewing the Irish immigrant household that my grandfather grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts. When he fought in World War II and came home, the access that my grandfather had to the GI Bill, the access he had to education loans, the access he had to home loans, the access he had to friendly interactions in the bank, the access he had to given his choice of homes in neighborhoods and burgeoning suburbs where property values were growing exponentially, as opposed to neighborhoods in urban areas, or that, for that matter, in very rural areas, both of which property values were dropping at the same time in the 1950s. The moment in the bank that Jason and I experienced is one of the multiple and magnitude that exists within systemic and structural racism in America and continues to exist and exponentially compounds the inequality, the income inequality, the wealth and intergenerational wealth inequality. It's an inequality with regards to food justice, with regards to the educational system. All of that comes from the magnitude of those little moments, right? And if young folks are given the language to see that reality and call it for what it is in the moment, I think we have an opportunity of helping affect some of that change, again, for the generation that wants to make this change happen for sure. Okay, I've talked too much. I would love to open this up to questions. I know that there already are some from the crowd, but I do want to prioritize Aaliyah, who is the lone courageous young person who has come to meet the challenge, and I'm here for you. So please let me know what your questions are and how I can help.
So Leah, we will start with you first.
Okay. So I don't really have a lot of questions. I do know that I made sure to put All American Boys on my list for reading. Because hearing you describe what it talked about really interested me. And I was also looking into finding the other talk too, even though I may not be able to relate with the things they talk about in it. Yeah. I'd still like to have insight on how other people live and what they go through in their households.
Aaliyah, I really appreciate that. And I one of the things that I try to do in the other talk that I think I hope resonates with young folks all across the country, regardless of the communities that they grow up in, is highlighting some of the acts for justice that young folks are doing as well, right? So whether that's young folks who are holding necessary protests at their schools, or young folks who are connecting because of the ways that you are able to connect in ways that I couldn't when I was your age with people, across the country. Speaking with some young people in Sacramento who were trying to do a Black Lives Matter march with other young folks in Iowa at the same time, even though they'd never met. And I appreciate, first of all, you just being here, but second of all, being in some way connected to all these young folks who, for lack of a better way of saying it, give a damn and want to do something about it. And so I appreciate you so much.
Yeah. I can't say it's not like race isn't really talked about in my schools, like the schools I've been to. I went to Rogers, and then now I go to John Adams Middle School. And neither of the schools talked about race. My entire elementary school career, we never did anything for Black History Month. They may have put up a picture or told us about Martin Luther King Jr., but that's all they did. Usually when in conversations, if my race comes up, people get it gets awkward. They don't know if they can say that I'm Black or if they should say I'm African American. I'm like, it gets a little awkward.
Yeah.
So I'm glad it's being addressed. And there's
I appreciate that. And Aaliyah, you're speaking up and speaking the truth, right here in front of all these people. And I think all too often, many people who are not speaking up take for granted that other people are going to. and here you are, probably the youngest person on this call, who's speaking up. And as I hear it, if I were somebody who lived in your community, I would hear this as partly a call to action. A little bit about, what can we do to get involved to make sure that the schools are doing a better job? Because as I hear you talk about it right now, it feels to me like there's a long road ahead of them to do a better job talking about the truth.
Yeah. I'm glad I had the chance to talk to you. I did definitely I learned a lot from what you said. It put things into a different perspective, I'd say. So thank you for being on the CRJ meeting tonight. So.
Yeah, Thank you. And make sure that whatever adults you're connected to reach out to me, because I made promises to any young folks who came here tonight, and I will fulfill those promises.
Yay. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions for you, Brendan. I first want to start with, how you have been interacting with several families across the country at this point. What has been the response that, in dealing with, white families, and what have you found to be, what is the reaction? And then at the same time too, what are the takeaways that, folks on this call can do as far as ensuring that they're moving in the right path, right? So.
Yes, thank you. So I'm listening to your question, and I want to answer the first part two ways, because there is life while talking about this book and the interactions I've had with folks this year, and then there's a broader perspective with this. So I just want to share a little bit of both, if I can, because to be honest, given the political nature of our country right now, I've only been invited to spaces that want to hear me talk about this, right? With regards to the other talk, I haven't been in the public situations that I have been in the past where there has been as much pushback. Now, that's not to say that there hasn't already been a significant amount of pushback. There has been, but it's different. And so what I want to say is that I've been in some book clubs with families. And it's been in one instance, it was a multiracial group, but in the other two instances, it was a group of families. They were all white, and it was in all of these situations. What has been heartbreaking to hear is listening to young people say things like, "Well, in our family, in all these instances, in our families, we're Democrats, and we can't be friends with the children whose parents are Republicans." And it breaks my heart that conversations are so dangerous that kids' friendships are disrupted, right? And I was teasing one group of young people because I was saying, well, what if they're cute? You can't even talk to the cute ones, whatever, because that's what matters to a lot of the young folks. And it's heartbreaking to see that they already understand how divided their communities are. And what I'm speaking about in particular, I'm speaking about families that I was talking to in Traverse City, Michigan, where there was a big news story this past summer where there was a lot of division about are they teaching CRT in the classrooms? Likewise, I was speaking with families in Loudoun County, Virginia, which was another place where there was national news, same kind of attack. And so I think what I'm hearing is right now a lot of people struggling to figure out how to have conversations cross community because the divides are so deep, and that bothers me. So I wonder if, to then address, before I go to the other book, to address the second half, your second part B of your question, the what can this group do, is I wonder what it would be like to try to create story exchanges with people who disagree with this group, and make the white people do the dangerous part, which is having to interact and share stories to some extent. And this is, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. So again, I am not an expert. I'm just sharing this as a potential idea. So please take that for what it's worth. But I have found in many of my own professional development opportunities when I was in education, when those patient colleagues of mine said, Brendan, go do some more work, I got involved in as many professional development opportunities as I could. And one of them created situations where we would have fishbowl conversations where, for example, a bunch of us white folks would be in the middle of a room and folks from the global majority would sit around and they would listen to us struggling to have a conversation. And then they would give us, some feedback like, oh, that thing you said or you were sharing, that actually hurts me, blah, 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 blah. I wonder if there wouldn't be some opportunity for your group to do a combination of things, something like that. But also, what if there are some families with young folks who are young white folks who are struggling with guilt and shame, who do feel like, oh, now they're just saying all the white kids are evil and blah, 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 which I don't endorse or believe and I think is a lot of hoo-ha, but to give folks a constructed space to share why they feel that way and allow other people to share, this is why we have to tell these stories, it could be a constructive way to bring a couple of people in. Now, I'm not talking about, bringing in neo-Nazis like that, but I'm talking about, folks who maybe through fear, guilt, shame, etc., if they're given a chance to speak a little bit, then it is required of them to do the necessary listening and to story swap. There's an organization called Narrative 4 that does this kind of work all over the world. Israel and Palestine, in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, in schools here in New York City, et cetera, et cetera. They have a model for it. And I think that would be one to follow. Now, very briefly, and then we'll go on to the next question because I know there are more. Just to say the other thing about families, talking to families. When Jason and I were traveling around talking about All American Boys, it was, so when the book was published in 2015, and all of the school communities we were first invited to were predominantly Black. White folks were not inviting us to come talk about police brutality at first, but the Black communities were, and it was humbling for me to be invited into these spaces and to listen time and time and time and time and time again to the enormity of stories that folks wanted to share. And the book provided, honestly, more often than not, a community opportunity for people in the community to begin to share their own stories. Whereas when we then started going into more communities that were predominantly white, there was so much of it was, oh, we're listening to what is happening to folks of the global majority, or we're reading books like, if you can see half of the books on my shelf behind me, like we're reading books like Caste, or we're blah, blah, blah. But there wasn't the same sharing of stories. And so I feel like that's why white folks, I think, could do a better job sharing and being honest about our access to social advantage that is unfair and unjust. And if we have to tell our stories, if I have to tell my stories about being pulled over by the police, or the stories of foolishness in the neighborhood when I was young, or the stories of being a child actor and model, or the stories of my experience in college, or my first role as a teacher in high school, or my jobs in book publishing, if I have to tell all of my personal stories and include my racial identity, and talk about my racial identity in each of those situations, I'm forced to talk about the injustice of social advantage. And I think more white folks doing that could influence some of the conversation. Not to take more mic time away from folks whose stories need to be heard, but if we're going to tell our stories, I think to do it more honestly. I hope that helps answer your questions.
No, you nailed it. You nailed it, because I was really trying to dive in, like you said, and look at the sentiment as it's changed over the progression of the two books that you've done. And then just real quickly, and I'll kick it off over to Robbie, you mentioned that you have 5 chapters, each dedicated on listening, right? If you could kind of just briefly tell us the names of those chapters, perhaps, sure. And then, sure. I mean, I'm selling your book at the same time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
But I mean, folks, want to know kind of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's so they work like this. And so the progression of the book is, again, like I said, telling some of my own stories, how that leads into a broader situation of how my stories are connected to historical structural racism and contemporary systemic racism in America. And then it gets to a chapter, it's called A Hard Look in the Mirror. And And then it gets to, and I'm skipping over one, but then it gets to a question about what bullying looks like to a whole community. And these are stories in which I'm sharing stories of me listening to young people sharing their stories. And then it gets to a question of messing up. And I'm sharing a story of when I was at the white privilege conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and myself and another white colleague messed up because we weren't appropriately listening to an indigenous woman who was basically claiming that she had been erased at a white privilege conference talking about racism. Yet again, indigenous folks had been erased, and in Albuquerque. And it was, it's a story of listening. And then it moves into the messing up and listening more, and listening to who, listening without getting defensive, listening and believing. And that leads us to taking action. So it's all those chapters of listening. I hope that clarifies it.
Oh, no, once again, you nailed it. So I'm going to go to Craig Ali, who seems to have a question, and then I will take it back. Craig?
Hey, I want to thank you. I'd like to first make an observation, which will then lead into a question. And the observation is essentially, for the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. And the reason why I bring this up is that in looking at that, I am not surprised at the amount of resources that are being laid out to those Ukrainians who have been traumatized by war. As is the case, when you have war, you have victims and trauma. But so many of the resources are geared toward Vladimir Putin and Russia. Mm-hmm. And the parallel I'm drawing is one of great pain, because I look at South Africa over the years, really decades before, something not even as similar was brought to bear on the apartheid, system within this. To put it in a nutshell, it's a real issue when white folks traumatize other white folks, but when it comes to traumatizing people of color, it's not as much of a thing, at least to the point where which resources can be brought to bear to address the trauma. In your book, the All-American Boys, you had talked about the police. And I'm wondering specifically, when you looked at the organization you had talked about, is there a section within that thing that addresses the conflict between communities of color and people who are abused by the police? I understand, the whole question about the Israeli and the Palestinian and the Catholic and the Protestant. But I mean, this is something that is cancerous in this nation. Yes. And I'm wondering specifically just what, if any, resources or guidance that is being addressed to address, this spectrum of racism.
Yeah.
If indeed that is something that we can touch on.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. And I, not being affiliated with Narrative 4, I'm speaking out of turn a little bit. I don't know specifically if they have done any workshops in that fashion, but I will share this anecdote with you, because if they are or they aren't, I hope there are other organizations that are doing something similar. When All American Boys was the Greater Rochester Teen Read book in Rochester, New York, a number of years ago. And it was a tremendous honor for a whole variety of reasons. And I And what happened was we went to an alternative learning institution in Rochester, where many of the young folks in the institution have had horrific interactions with police, is in the ways that you're describing it, right? The workshop was with police officers and these young folks. And we spoke about All American Boys for about 5 minutes. And then the other hour and a half was the community talking. And they gave a lot of airtime in particular to let the young folks talk about why they were so dismissive of law enforcement and the language law enforcement used when they said, well, we're here to help and protect, etc. When they would just describe their lives as being bullied and brutalized at the hands of law enforcement. And I share that with you because it's my one, it's through All American Boys, there have been some other circumstances like this as well. That also happened in the St. Louis metro area. We've also had this kind of interaction with this book in a handful of other communities. And I only share that to say, those are my only personal interactions with the scenario you're suggesting. But again, Angela's part B of her question, I wonder if that isn't something this group could help facilitate in a way that would be interesting and meaningful. Because I'm an outsider, right? So I can't speak with law enforcement in Santa Monica and with the young folks with the same authority that you all can. And honestly, Craig, I just like I said to Aaliyah, I feel like I'm hearing, when I hear you speak and just ask this question, if I were in the audience and I lived in your community, I would want to ask you, what can we do to address what you're speaking about right there in Santa Monica? And I wonder if there isn't a way to facilitate that kind of a conversation, and maybe ask Narrative 4 to come in and be the brokers to facilitate that conversation, because they've done tough conversations. I just can't with 100% certainty say if they've done it with young folks and police or not.
If I can, I think we're in a strange position in that the city is so small. I'm not sure just what kind of resources the city council and even sensitivity the city council has. This is me speaking based on my observations as a resident here. I'm sure if anybody could do it, we in the church in Ocean Park could do it. But the question becomes in terms of cooperation.
Right.
And that's, I don't see the seriousness.
So in Rochester,
that'll be the end of what it is I have to say on all that.
Well, I will just say, because in Rochester, the reason why it worked out. So Rochester has the one of the highest child poverty rates for a city of its size in the country, and the police have a reputation, a terrible reputation of their interactions with young poor folks. The law enforcement had resource officers whose job it was to help improve their PR, essentially. And that was the entry point in order to get some of these things happening, the book talk with All American Boys. And I just wonder if there isn't a way to lean on their sense of pride to create access for a meaningful conversation that essentially operates as a space to let young folks who feel brutalized and victimized by the police an opportunity to share their stories publicly and be heard. That's anyway.
Brendan, Committee for Racial Justice, out of Committee for Racial Justice came something for Coalition for Police Reform. And we actually created a program called African American Community Academy on Police. What is it? ACAP, African American Community Academy for Policing. And it's on policing. And it's exactly that, where police come in to the community, and they hear about our community, hear our stories. We do some, role play, all of that. But that has never been able to take fully take place. We're still working on that with the new chief. He's looking into it. I don't know, maybe Angela sits on the commission. Maybe she can speak more to that. But right now, we actually have a couple more questions. And so one is from Yolanda Lewis. Yolanda says, thank you, Brendan, so much for using your privilege to talk about the reality that so many Black and Brown people face daily. You do it with passion and energy. So do you have any insights and tips on or hacks to getting into the listening of white people to hear these stories, to get interested in hearing your perspective?
I appreciate that question. And I'm pausing for a second because I want to, one thing that I think is, I first of all, thank you. And second of all, I think it's, this sounds maybe a little pedestrian, but I think there's, if the question is asking, how do we get more white folks to more actively listen? Then I wonder if there isn't, again, a backdoor way of doing this kind of work where, you offer a book club, for example, for everyone to read Nickel Boys. But the setup is also that for people who want to share stories that why this book resonates with them, it creates an opportunity for people to share their stories about why it resonates with them. And maybe it's not Nickel Boys, maybe it's another book, but something that is, and I would argue using fiction is sometimes easier, though I hope that people also read nonfiction. Wow. But I think that something like that, again, it's like using something to facilitate the storytelling, and folks then who show up who are white like me have to listen.
Well, I didn't want to go before you, but I want to say to Yolanda and everybody on the call that our city manager actually has already kind of agreed to doing a city, looking into doing the citywide reads with the library and with, the entire city. So that's our book club for the whole city. So he's already, he's not opposed to it. It's just about setting it up. So that's a great way to do that. I mean, if you can't get people in like that, I don't know what you can do.
I know. Exactly.
Yeah. So let's go to Maureen. Maureen says, your story about declaring that you were innocent in the ninja incident is such an effective way of illustrating white people's complicity in racism. Would you be willing to share that story?
Thank you, Maureen. If it's the Maureen I'm thinking of.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. That's my aunt and uncle over there, friends. I appreciate them. I love them.
Aunt Maureen and uncle.
I'll try to tell it briefly because I want to get to other questions too. But I think it is. I'm grateful to get the chance to share this story because in short, when I was in middle school in the summers between grades, some of us would goof around and we would stay over at a friend's house whose parents were never around. And that meant we could do whatever the heck we wanted. And so often what we did is we would fool around at night in the neighborhood. And we would dress up in all black clothing. We would put t-shirts over our heads and tie the arms behind so we could only see through the neck hole. And we called them ninja runs. And now we were 4, 5, 6, depending on the number, white boys. And I'll get to that terminology in a second. But the point that my Aunt Maureen is bringing up is important because we would run around and we would, at that time, everybody had Time Warner cable in our neighborhood. And we all had the same gray cable boxes and the same gray remotes. And so we figured out that if you ran around with the remote, you could change this, you could point it through someone's window and change the stations or turn the TV on and off, whatnot. Anyway, we got into all kinds of trouble and we scared some people quite a bit. And, again, the kind of stuff you can get away with when you're white like me, that's terrorizing. And yet you get patted on the shoulder and say, well, you're just a kid fooling around. We eventually got caught and nobody called the police on us to send us to actually have the law come down on us. They just called our parents, and we got in trouble with our parents. Now, my father, to his credit, was the only one of all the parents who were called that evening to say, you're going to have to go knock on doors and apologize. You're going to have to say, I'm sorry I did this to you. And most of the other, frankly, fathers didn't want to do that. They just wanted it to go away, which maybe is a metaphor for how white people think about racism in America, as opposed to owning up to it. They just want it to go away. And I think that part of my reasoning with my father was, I'm not the one who was toggling the remote. I'm not the one who knocked on the window and scared this old lady. That was someone else in my group, etc. But my father said, did you step in and stop them? Did you say, this is not okay? Did you say someone might be afraid? Did you say this is gonna affect somebody in a negative way? No, then you are complicit. And I think that, I appreciate the chance to share that story from the book, because it is a way to talk about whiteness and white racial identity that I don't, all too often I've heard people complain, white folks like me complain, well, I didn't set up this system of structural racism, or I didn't commit the original sin of slavery in America and displacement and genocide of indigenous folks. This is, it's somebody else's fault, not mine. But the more that I don't step up to stop the legacy of all that horror, the perpetuation of those horrors today, as Craig was mentioning with regards to law enforcement, is one example, right? If I'm not stepping up to say something, then I'm part of the problem, because I am allowing those bad actors to continue. And it's not just the bad actors' faults. I might have to take a hard look in the mirror, as I say in the book, and actually see my own face as one of those bad actors who's not stepping up to try to stop the people who are, especially the ones who are closest to me. So whether that's our friends and white folks like me when growing up, getting other young white folks to not say the N-word just because they're repeating lyrics from a song. This is important stuff. Language affects attitude affects behavior. And I think that's essential, right? So if we don't address problems of language, we can't address the problems of behavior. So I thank you, Maureen, for allowing me to share that story, because I think it's important to recognize that silence is complicity, and silence and inaction is enabling the ugliness of racism to continue. And so more white folks like me can't claim innocence. We're actually a part of the problem if we're not speaking up.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So we have just a couple of questions left. I have two, and then I'm going to pass it off to Bob for our final question. So my two questions are, number one, at what age do you think children could be introduced to race-based issues, such as your book? And then the second part of that is, and this is like everyone wants to book you now. So the other question is, what's the best way to connect you to a Los Angeles middle school community? So those are two different questions. And then I have my final one over to one of our other.
Well, and if there is another question or two after that, I don't mind going a little bit over the time limit. I appreciate the hard drop, but I can stick around for a few more minutes if people want, but your call. But first, let me just say that the easy part, the second part of your question, people can go to theauthorvillage.com. I'm sorry to say, it's so much easier for me to have someone else manage this, because I will just mess it up. So I work with, no, you're fine. I work with a group called the Author Village, and I would love to come and I think if I think I would love to speak to as many communities as possible, and please have me come, and I will gladly talk about this. I will also say one idea is, if you look at who the other authors are in the Author Village, pairing what I have to say with what some of the other folks on there, like, for example, Samira Ahmed, who wrote a book called Internment, which imagines a near future America with Muslim internment camps, which for her felt real and present just a couple of years ago. There may be opportunities for some interesting dialogue. I would love to come. Please invite me, but also I want to. I want that also to provide access and opportunity for others to speak as well at the same time, so we can have, I think, meaningful conversation. But to get to your first part, I think about, I was talking to a librarian in Denver, Colorado, who was talking about kindergartners who were, who, because they haven't had conversations yet about skin color, were already having these conversations without any guidance yet. And without any guidance came some hurtful commentary from kindergartners. And the people, more often than not, who are harmed in these kinds of innocent or maybe ignorant conversations, right, are folks of the global majority, folks who do not identify as white. And so it makes me think that there is no age too young to not start having conversations about race and racial identity. Jessie, my wife, and I are trying to figure out how to navigate those conversations with our, son who turns 3 in May. He's a young white boy who needs to understand about that racial identity in his life in New York City. And I think, again, finding ways to have empowering conversations do nothing more than empower us. And the research is out there. It's evident. There were articles about this in the New York Times this past summer, about all the research that's out there. When talking with young folks openly and honestly about race and racism, it empowers young kids of color to feel like their realities that they see and witness and feel every day are affirmed and not gaslit, as is too often the case. And it provides young white kids an opportunity to feel like they have language to engage in the conversations that they too see, but are taught. If we're taught from a young age not to talk about racial identity and not to talk about racism because it's going to be too uncomfortable, then as it comes up in our day-to-day life over and over and over again, we are taught to remain silent. And we have to unlearn that and learn a language of empowerment with regards to engaging in meaningful conversations about racial justice. That kind of empowerment, just to be clear. But so I don't think the short answer is there is no age too young.
I mean, again, I think you nailed it, because like you said, it's racism is a social construct, right? You learn these things at home.
Yes.
So that is probably where you should start to tailor the correct learnings. If you are your child's first teacher, then how responsible is that? How responsible must you be in that teaching?
Right.
So I'd like to hand it off to Bob Gord, who has a question. This might be one of our final questions. So yes, Bob.
You're on.
Oh, you have to unmute yourself, Bob. Unmute yourself.
Also, Bob, I owe you an email. I apologize.
Oh, good. You just answered one of my questions.
All right.
You did get my.
I'm mortified.
My review. I'm so happy that you did.
I have a long response.
Great to see you again.
Likewise.
This isn't really a question, I have to admit, but I want to urge everyone on this call, go out and get Brendan's book and read it. It's a great read, even for adults. And it's a brilliant book for young people. I think you will agree with me on that point. And then let's try to urge the Santa Monica schools to use this book in middle school classes. You know, with all this suppression of the truth out there, we're sort of lucky to be connected with a district that is committed to anti-racist teaching. And so I think we would have a real shot at making that happen. I think that would be a great thing. So everybody do what you can. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Bob. I'm getting back to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Thank you.
What
And
I wanted to say to everyone is to this video should be out, I think, in a day or so. Get the video and send it to everyone that you can that will listen. I know we started it a little bit late, but still the basic stuff is the real meat is there. I'm definitely going to send it to every school administrator that I contacted that agreed that they liked the idea, they loved the workshop, and they wanted to send children, send students, and even high school students who would have gotten community service for it. So San Mo High ASB definitely will get a copy of the video. That's up to their teachers if they want to give them extra credit for listening to it. But yeah, I think if we get the video out to as many people as we can, and definitely, you know, Brendan will be following up about the courageous conversations with the city and the library. So that's what we can do. And thank you.
Grateful to be here. Thank you.
And Janet had her hand up as well.
Hi, first I want to say thank you also, Brandon, for beautiful. Now I love the book, and I am connected with the Interfaith Council. So I think about the fact that there are a lot of young youth groups in many different faith traditions who are looking for programs. Okay, so anybody that wherever you go, if you don't go, that's fine. But if you go someplace and you have a faith community, ask the leadership if they would have this as a program, because sometimes it's more palatable if it comes that way.
I really appreciate that very much, and I think we've spoken about this before, but I'm eager to be in conversation in a context like that in faith communities, because I think there is real meaning and power that comes from faith. And if your faith can help motivate you to be engaged in real action that is towards justice, then let's get moving on it. I mean, it's striking to me, as I think I mentioned before in another context, that I feel like our many of our faith communities are failing us by not engaging in conversations of racial justice with real integrity. And it's I've had this conversation with some folks in Texas who are in the Catholic community in Texas. And so I really appreciate you sharing this right now, because she too has tried to get her Catholic community in Texas to be much more embracing of this book than they were in the past, where Jason and I have been disinvited to book festivals and schools and you name it, but nothing compared to what the actual folks in the communities are going through.
You know, I think it's kind of funny that you're talking about the faith community, and you're talking about when I think of this, I think, okay, so I'm looking at the screen, I'm like, okay, so really we're preaching to the choir here, because everybody here is in social justice mode already. They're already involved in groups up to here on social justice. But it's like at churches, I know particularly at Black churches, sometimes it's very hard to get people to join the choir or to join any of the auxiliary groups. Because sometimes, when I think about joining the choir, people think they don't have a voice. So the people that should be getting this book out and sharing it with folks, maybe they think they don't have a voice. So that's why it's really important to just send this video and let people see the video, and maybe that's a way of opening it up especially for those who are on here, CRJ members, who feel like you don't have a voice. You do have a voice. You have Brendan's voice. All you have to do is send it out. So yeah,
I appreciate that analogy. Use me as you will, folks.
Okay, so are we gonna close out, y'all? Is that all the questions so far? I think that's it.
Can we give one more shout out to Aaliyah, because she's she came in here and,
Yeah.
and was
You know,
courageous enough to get the thing started, please.
I think we need to give Aaliyah a book.
For
what
sure.
She
That's
said
what I'm
she
saying.
wanted a book, so we need to get her a book.
Oh, like I said, whoever is connected adults to Aaliyah, reach out to me because there are multiple promises I have to fulfill.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so and then they would just contact the village. That village contact. Okay.
Yeah. If anybody, well, if you want to, if you want me to come speak, you would contact me through the author village.
Oh, okay.
For Aaliyah's family, connect to
Joanne for the evening.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. Yeah.
I kind of already ordered one online.
You get a book, you get a free book. You don't gotta order it.
Aaliyah, I'm gonna send you. I'm gonna send you a whole bunch. Don't worry.
Okay.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, Aaliyah. See, for now you can go show your book off at school to your friends who didn't participate.
Also,
and maybe he'll autograph it for you, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Leah, I'm actually going to see Jason on Thursday, so I'm going to get him to sign it too, and then we'll get it.
Oh, wonderful! That's great. Yep. See what happens when you have a voice. Okay, well, I guess Janet.
Yeah. Okay, I'll close. Okay. We switch off sometimes. Okay, so if it's me, then this is a repeat after me, a call and response. So everybody, you can do it the chaotic way. This is fine. So everybody unmute. And then I say something and you repeat it, okay? I'm not free.
I'm not
free.
Well, you're free.
You're free.
You're not free.
You're not free.
Well, I'm free.
Until I'm free.
I'm not stopping.
I'm
not stopping.
We're all free.
We're all free.
Okay. Thank you, you all.
Great night, everybody.
Have
a great week.
Thank you, Reverend. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good to see you, Jasmine. Good to see you, Rob.
Happy Women's History Month.